Thanks for braving the weather and coming out today. My name's Ian Whittaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks for joining the first solution session at the 2018 Global Food Security Symposium, Sustaining Planetary Health in the Face of Rising Food Demand. Before we begin, please silence your phones. Know that we're live streaming this session and all the sessions today, and that we're on the record. Please note that views of individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional views or positions of the Council on Global Affairs. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session for about 15 minutes. We'll be taking questions from in the room. You can also submit questions online using our browser-launched app. Just go to chi.cnf.io, put that into your browser. You can ask a question, you can vote on people's questions. You can also answer some polling that we're going to do too. Just a quick thank you as well to our next generation rapporteurs who are here today. They're taking notes for us. We appreciate that. I'll hand over the mic in just a second, but just very quickly, you should have picked up a bio on the way in that has people's information, our speakers' information, but just very quickly, we have today Fabrice de Klerk in the first seat here. He's the Science Director at EAT. Next to Fabrice is Catherine Christ, the Director of Strategic Initiatives and International Development at PATH. In the third seat, we have Howdy Buis from Harvest Plus. Next to him is Jinya Truitt-Nakata, the Director of Lands and Latin America at the Nature Conservancy. And our chair today is Roger Thoreau, the Senior Fellow for Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, and I'll second Ian for the thanks and congratulations for making your way here and braving the elements. I recall back when I think it was shortly after Obama's inauguration, it was a big snowstorm here, and the government closed. And he said, hey, if we're going to get along over the next several years, Washington's got to toughen up a little bit. They have not. And so the city still goes into panic mode. So yeah, thanks for coming. I think this is panel will be a really great treat. Well done for deciding to come here. As Ian said, and with the introductions, we've got a really terrific panel. I know everybody, friends, sources, contacts through the years. Some have appeared in my writing, so thanks for that. I hope, right? And they're really, all stars in basically looking at the big picture and the big issues that face us in coming decades. They're all pioneers in bringing better nutrition to people everywhere in a way that preserves our environment and biodiversity. They're leaders in forging this new way forward so we can both nourish the planet and save the planet in coming decades. And so this imperative, avoiding this collision of these two great challenges that we're facing, both how do we nourish the planet and save the planet at the same time, I think is really humanity's greatest task, greatest imperative in coming decades. And it's great to see some students here, Auburn crowd in particular, who I've been meeting over the years, because this is also then your tremendous challenge, and what we're counting on you guys to sort out after everyone here lays the groundwork and forges the way. And success in this will require this new era of human cooperation in terms of reaching across all development sectors. Because where we find ourselves sitting at the moment is right at this nexus of agriculture, nutrition, environment, climate change, snow in DC on the first day of spring, and human health, animal health, plant health, insect health, water quality, soil health, soil conditions, and all living things on this planet. We're all connected on the global food chain. And that's precisely where everybody is working and sitting at that nexus, and particularly PATH and Catherine's work. And so we'll start with you, Catherine. And if you could, kind of describe why these kind of comprehensive interventions and this reaching across and this multisectoral approach is just so critical now, and kind of how PATH is then leading the way on that.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming and braving the weather. It's really nice to see a full house. Yeah, so I think we, at PATH, we've been very interested in looking at this sort of multi-sector approach, and I think the reason, or one of the reasons why a health organization now is beginning to start to look at the effects of our programs both on people and the planet is because we are, I think, in many ways coming late to the game, but we are starting to recognize that climate has everything to do with agriculture. Agriculture has everything to do with nutrition. Nutrition has everything to do with health of the people. People have everything to do with the health of the planet, and the planet's health has everything to do with climate change. So we are in a very big system where we have to be very careful how we pull levers in one sector that don't disrupt other issues and have negative externalities in other sectors. And I think we're seeing now these incredible mega trends that are really going to have an effect on the way that we look at these multisectoral programs, increasing populations, rising incomes. Those are really having effects on the way people's food choices are playing out, most notably towards higher quality foods like animal source proteins, fruits and vegetables. What does that mean for us as a globe where we're not just trying to build staple foods for people, but really trying to get a higher quality diet? And certainly thinking about this nexus between water, agriculture, and I know Fabrice is probably going to talk more in depth about this, but how those systems relate to each other and how we go about thinking about programs that are going to have a lower environmental footprint, where we're taking into consideration up front what some of those externalities are across sectors. And I'm really heartened, I think, to see that the development community writ large is now beginning to really focus on these multi-sectoral sorts of issues. You see new journals that are being developed that are bringing in this type of cross-sectoral work, like Lancet Planetary Health. You're seeing the Planetary Health Alliance, you're seeing EAT, you're seeing the Bridge Collaborative, which is a program that I know well. We're working with the Nature Conservancy, the International Food Policy Research Institute, Duke University, and about 150 different other people from across all of those sectors and organizations to really start to try and think more concertedly about how we talk across sectors, how we rank and rate data, and how we use that to build new programs. So I'm actually optimistic that it's a new era for the community to work together, and also a little daunted by what we have in front of us as we're really seeing the effects of climate change and how those are affecting development and health programs as well.
The Bridge Collaborative that Catherine mentioned, it's brand new. Maybe the thinking is going on for a while, but the implementation of it was just launched last October.
Yep, that's right.
I think in London. Fabrice was also there, and Catherine. And yeah, a lot of excitement building up around this, that just that we need a whole new way of thinking and approach to this. And Howdy is someone that, for a number of years already is on the ground, basically putting this into effect, particularly on the marriage and the coming together of agriculture and nutrition, which should have always been together, but found their way apart over the years. Howdy is the pioneer of biofortification and Harvest Plus, and the whole range of biofortified crops that are out there. Agriculture, nutrition, human health, the 1,000 days area. So Howdy, why is I mean, what are you finding on this cooperation between agriculture and nutrition? Why is that so essential?
Yeah. So I'm based in a group of agricultural research centers. So I often address agricultural policymakers. So I sometimes I begin with a trick question, and I say, what's more individually to you as individuals, what's more important to you, to have good health or to have a high income? And always 100% of the people in the room, they raise their hand, of course my health is more important than my income. And I say, okay, I'll come back to that question at the end of my talk. So So then I talk about what's been happening in agriculture and why there's so much malnutrition. So one of my pet peeves is people say there's enough food in the world, it's just a matter of distributing it more equally. Well, I really disagree with that statement. I think it's still simplistic, but I think you have to divide food into staple foods and non-staple foods, vegetables, fruits, animal products, pulses. Probably there are enough staple foods in the world if they were distributed equally. There is enough staple foods. But definitely there's not enough fruits and vegetables, the things that give dietary quality. Those prices in developing countries over the past 50 years, prices of the vegetables, fruits that give quality, they have doubled, they have tripled in developing countries. The price of food staples has come down somewhat, but those other prices have gone up because the supplies haven't kept pace with population growth with demand. So if you're a poor person, your income hasn't changed, it gets harder and harder to afford dietary quality. So vitamin A, iron, zinc gets more and more expensive over time. And this is the underlying cause why there's so much mineral and vitamin deficiencies in the world. And it's because the agricultural policies haven't paid attention to increasing the supplies of those foods either. One of the ways that we've tried to address the problem, it's not the only way, but it's part of the solution, is to breed more vitamin A, more iron, more zinc into staple food crops. They're just as high yielding. They sell for the same price in the market. But when you substitute a biofortified variety for a non-biofortified variety in the diet each day, you get about an extra 40% of your estimated average requirement. You have to pay up front for the agricultural research to develop the crops, but once they're in the system, you don't have recurrent costs, and it's just a very cost-effective way of putting more of these minerals and vitamins in the diet at no extra cost to the consumers. So anyway, I go through the story in more detail to the agricultural policymakers, and then I come back to my original question. And I say, okay, now when you go back to your jobs and you're making decisions on agricultural policies for your country, what's going to be your number one objective? To increase income of your country or to improve the health of your country? And unfortunately, well, they realized they'd been tricked, but most of them still raise their hand and they say, I'm going to be most concerned about income and reducing poverty, and I'm not going to be that concerned in making my policies about the health of the country, the nutrition. So that's what we're up against. We have to get people in all different sectors to realize that everything is interconnected, and the most efficient way to address these problems is to realize these interactions and invest in strategies that take that into account.
The Nature Conservancy is one that these new partnerships, reaching out. I mean, you might think that, well, the Nature Conservancy, conservation, environment organization, working with perhaps some strange bedfellows over the years, in terms of also then having to realize, I have to work with the farmers, the suppliers, the whole food chain, because that working with them then will help benefit the biodiversity preservation and the environment. I mean, Ginger, so if you can talk a little bit about some of that the Nature Conservancy is in, and in Can One, can we continue to produce more food and nourish the planet, and at the same time save the planet?
Thanks, Roger. Actually, it's the only thing that we can do. I think what amazes me is that we ever tried to separate those topics in the first place, frankly. And I think, so let's just a friendly reminder of some of the facts and why we're concerned. So 70% of deforestation globally is caused by agriculture and ranching. And by 2030, so that's 12 years from now, okay, we have all of these reductions in emissions, all of this work on that side of the equation. So by 2030, 70% of our emissions will come from agriculture, right? But at the same time, agriculture is unique as an economic sector because it is wholly dependent upon its host assets. So that's the soil, the water, the biodiversity, on both the agricultural lands and in the surrounding natural lands. That's what people don't understand. It's not just that land. The surrounding natural areas are actually really critical to maintaining that climate. And to be productive and profitable, the producers must draw upon these assets, which profoundly impacts them every time they're used. So the way we do most agriculture today, with our focus on yield and intensification, monocropping in many places, that actually has really weak resilience to climate change. And natural disasters, pests, diseases, this kind of thing, because it sacrifices ecological balance and uses over application of fertilizers, tillage, this kind of thing. And by the way, neither conventional nor organic are immune to that. They both do it in different ways. So that's a really important distinction, I think. At TNC, we promote what we call healthy agricultural systems. And what we do is to adopt regenerative farming principles that are not only ecologically resilient, but they're more productive precisely because they are more resilient. And so one example of this, which we do a lot in Colombia, for example, are integrated crop and livestock, what we call silvopastoral systems. And in these, you integrate pastures with native trees and fodder banks, which enable you to sink carbon, reforest native habitat, providing shade for your cattle, in turn increasing your productivity because the cattle are less stressed, produces higher quality beef, and you use less land. And all of this brings in a higher income for the producer. So using healthy agricultural systems actually enables us to pursue environmental goals that include carbon capture, biodiversity, habitat conservation, and soil regeneration. Put another way, it actually enables agricultural assets to be kept at their full productive potential. And so it is the very vitality of these assets that's going to make all the difference in the world when it comes to the profitability and the success of farming, ranching, and other agribusiness in the decades to come.
Yeah, and it's an immediate question, right? That it's like far off goals perhaps, but these are things that are coming now. So for beasts, one of the elements of all this then are the people who are eating and the consumers, and the shifting diets around the world are causing tremendous changes and tremendous stress on the global food chain and making this equation ever more difficult. And each mission is to kind of reform all this in the way that a healthy planet delivers healthier foods. So kind of tell us a little bit about what EAT is doing and why you're optimistic of that we can solve this.
Perfect.
Gordian knot.
Thanks. So EAT's slogan is "Food can fix it." So we certainly do try to put a positive spin on things, and I think you'll hear a lot about these issues with food systems: too much water, loss of biodiversity, loss of land, hungry people. And I think our main point is the extent to which food is the problem, really emphasize the extent to which food is the solution, and maybe our best bet at a solution. And I want to emphasize something that TNC said. So my background is in ecology and environment. I spent 6 years in Costa Rica and Colombia working on pastoral systems. But one of the things that I often tell my students and partners is, what's the world's biggest ecosystem? And people often think about the Amazon rainforest or these different tropical forest systems or tundra systems, but 40% of our global landscape is agricultural. So the largest ecosystem globally are agricultural ecosystems. And if we only see these as food production regions, we're going to miss the boat. And so this notion of restorative agriculture, I can't stress how important that is that this notion that agricultural lands need to be a place where we store carbon, where we produce food, where we produce healthy food, where we provide habitat connectivity for biodiversity, where our pollinators have access to the crops that we need pollination from, where water is improved rather than degraded. This is really the challenge. And so this notion of do no harm food production, that is way past, folks. We are not going to get there with do no harm approaches. So this notion of restorative, regenerative, making agricultural systems multifunctional really is mission critical. So at EAT, what we really have been striving for is to, one, we're a science-led organization, but creating a specific space where science, policy, private sector, and civil society can meet, interact, have difficult conversations, but more important, begin to coordinate and collaborate on solutions to, I think, fairly radical food system transformation. EAT started by Gunhild Stordalen, who worked with the Nordic Choice Hotels. Very simple conversation with Johan Rockström, one of the founders of the Planetary Boundaries concept, where she said, what should I be doing in my hotel to increase access to healthy food? And she was just struck by the lack of information on how we could really reform food systems, that beyond making changes within the hotel chain, she started to EAT as a place where we could have that conversation and really catalyze change towards health and sustainability. So now EAT is a collaboration between the Stordalen Foundation, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which is our scientific secretariat, and the Wellcome Trust, which is a UK philanthropic organization primarily known for its emphasis on health. So we see, again, health and science and private sector beginning to seek spaces for collaboration. But the last thing maybe to say before we move on is that what EAT wants to emphasize, that when we talk about food as part of the solution, is that we really look at trying to develop universal dietary guidelines. What is a healthy diet? And what do we need to be able to provide 10 billion people by 2050? As Howdy said, I think we're quite confident that this is no longer an issue about staple crops, but we recognize that we're overproducing red meat and that we're underproducing fruits, vegetables, and nuts, which are key elements of healthy diets. So how do we provide that healthy diet, and what is that healthy diet for 10 billion people? And how do you produce that sustainably? And here what we want to emphasize is that we're using an earth systems-based approach. And so it's not about organic versus conventional or GMO versus a no-till, but really understanding the role of agriculture in driving these global nutrient cycles, carbon, water, nitrogen and phosphorus, biodiversity, and land, and how agricultural systems can be set within a context where they contribute to restoring those cycles back within what we call planetary boundaries. So talk a bit about those later on, but I'll stop there, Roger.
Yeah, excellent, Fabrice. So earlier had mentioned the Bridge Collaborative, and I love that because if you look at both those words, they're really illustrative of what we're all talking about. Both bridges between people working in different sectors, and this need for collaboration, as everybody's been talking about. And that basically is a real shift from the thinking that's gone on for so long in the development sector, among development workers, practitioners on the ground, the donors, the business people, the policymakers, of thinking in silos and focusing on one specific aspect, but then losing track of everything else that's going on that could indeed undermine what it is that they're trying to do. And so, kind of always talking about breaking down these silos, but much easier said than done. Any examples from any of you on where you can see that one is making progress on this, and particularly say in and Howdy talked about the policymakers and finance ministers and others that are running their governments, also in terms of donors, and are they understanding this and driving this? Fabrice, Howdy?
I think one thing that we found quite useful is specifically this focus on food. Is that when my background in agriculture and conservation, it was TNC and CGIR was the organizations that were working with each other, and often quite conflictive. But we recognized as conservation biologists that we weren't going to get there unless we worked with agriculture. But what I found really powerful about food is that nutritionists have something to say about it, agriculture has something to say about it, health has something to say about it. Everyone in this room has something to say about it. I mean, we all eat 2 to 3 times a day. We can speak to our mothers, our grandmothers, our daughters about the food. We can speak to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Agriculture about food. It really is, I think, a gateway drug to sustainability and health, and really is a silo breaking, if you want, topic that allows those groups to come to the table with their baggage, but also begin to have a conversation about what interactions are between the two. And I think conservation and health have found that there is a strong need for collaboration between those domains, because the number one driver of premature mortality is food, and the number one driver of environmental degradation is food. And so you now have two groups, health professionals and conservation, who didn't interact with each other I'd say 5-10 years ago, who now recognize that they actually have the same vision and same, I think, tasks and goals.
Howdy?
Yeah, when I broached the topic to plant breeders in 1993 about breeding for more minerals and vitamins, they were pretty much against the idea. They said it wouldn't work anyway. We have to increase yields. We have to do pest resistance. Why would you want to do nutrition? That's a nutritionist's issue that they should deal with. And when I talked to the nutrition community about it, I said, well, maybe a cheaper way of addressing these problems is to provide funding to the agricultural researchers to breed these crops. And they said, no, we don't give money to agricultural research institutes. That's not what we do. The two communities weren't really talking to one another. So I think you need successes. You have an idea, but it's not enough just to have an idea. You actually have to show success on the ground, and then once you show success, then people get it and they realize that it's possible. So of course we had to find donors that would fund it, and a big hurdle that we had to get over was it takes 10 years to do the breeding. So the breeders were skeptical we could combine with high yields, the mineral and vitamin density. The nutritionists were skeptical that the amounts absorbed would be high enough to make a difference to nutritional status. The extensionists, people working in delivery, were skeptical that we could get farmers to adopt in large numbers. So you have all this skepticism. If you can find donors that will back you for that long, now we've shown that we can do it. We have 6 million farmers in 8 countries that are now growing and eating biofortified crops. We'll have in 60 countries, in 3 years from now, in 60 countries, we'll have biofortified crops already released and being sold to farmers. So now we have a lot of breadth. We don't have a lot of depth. We have a few individual country success stories. But now we have something really concrete that we've worked on over a 15-year period, and we can show people now it works. The nutrition communities and the agricultural communities are working together on this successful program.
Howdy has shown heroic persistence over the years, a modern day Don Quixote. So that's, yeah, Ginia and Catherine? Catherine?
Yeah, well, I mean, and he won a World Food Prize for that.
Yes,
and
we should mention that, right?
One of the themes that I continually am excited by and often overwhelmed by is really just the role of innovation and how quickly things are moving, particularly, in the context of a conference on youth. New technologies and the ability to use them to better track and predict and target as well as address. We focused on addressing things for a long time, but I think the use of data and new ideas that are up and coming that make people's lives easier, they help them understand where things are going, whether it's looking at predictive analytics, whether it's looking at data mining, whether it's looking at new biotechnologies that are going to really revolutionize the way that crop yields are going to function, that are going to have really significant impacts on health. And they're going to happen all across these sectors. It's going to happen in the health sector, it's going to happen in the environment sector, it's certainly happening already in the ag sector. And I think that some of the very cool things that are happening when I look at what the impacts of nutrition on nutrition are going to be, I come from the nutrition side, from the health side, have nothing to do with what the nutrition community is doing. It's coming from technology organizations, it's coming from pharma, it's coming from agriculture, it's coming from environment, and really trying to stay on top of these new, and IT in particular, trying to stay on top of these new developments when you are not trained to look across sectors is a real challenge. And I have noticed that when I work with people who are earlier in their career, early career professionals, I think frankly do that much better than my generation. We just weren't trained like that. But I think young people in particular show incredible innovation and creativity when it comes to thinking across these. And I really encourage those of you that work with and through the university system to try and engage in this way as well, because I think the university system actually is a little bit behind when it's thinking about multi-sector approaches, and I think we could do a little bit better.
Yeah, so curriculum and classwork that is cross-faculty and involves this is just critically important. Virginia?
You know, what I find interesting is if you look to the agribusiness sector, they've actually been very forward-leaning and forward-thinking in this space, at least more so recently. If we go back to the silvopastoral systems that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that you see is that when you raise cattle in these systems, you have a higher quality product coming out of it from a nutritional standpoint. So if you look at the dairy, you've got milk that's higher in oleic acids, fats, and solids. This creates for a higher valued product on the market without it being a niche market. So there are nutritional components to that. If it's beef, it's higher in amino acids. The cattle, again, as I mentioned, you've got an animal welfare component in there. The environment's being taken care of. And so it's this huge win-win-win. And we work with some companies, even particularly in the dairy space, who recognize that by taking care of the environment, their producers are able to produce more and higher caliber goods. And so this is something that I think is really exciting. I also think it's important to mention something that, you know, when you're looking at that balance in nutrients and food and the growing planet, we're all concerned about health, and we're all concerned about this growing demand for meat. I'm actually, this may sound a little crazy, but I'm actually a little concerned about everyone saying we should all go vegetarian and it'll handle all the problems. Because if we all went vegetarian, the amount of land that would have to go in production in order to sustain that would be, I mean, we would just kill the planet. So yes, we need to eat less beef, but no, there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to this problem.
And the country of Colombia, at the moment, is poised right on the juncture of this, of which way are they going to go as some of their vast stretches of savanna land opens up to development in one way or another, kind of in the post-peace treaty or the post-conflict period. And you guys are on the front lines of that.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at Colombia, Colombia is a real, I mean, I would, you know, if there's one country that you need to be paying attention to this year, it is Colombia. There are elections in May, and right now Colombia is you know, in this peace process. They're opening up the Orinoquia to development. Now, they're trying to do everything right. They're a leader in the Tropical Forest Alliance. They're collaborating with all kinds of folks, TNC included, in terms of how do you open up this land for productivity, how do you make it something that's sustainable for the long run, how do you take a green approach? And so they're trying to do the right thing. However, if you talk to them, if you look at the papers that are out there, if you talk to different folks in the different ministries, et cetera, there is no consensus about how much of those really critical grasslands should be converted and how they'll be converted. And again, with this election around the corner, you know, are they actually going to be a beacon of light that we can all look to for this is actually the way you get all of those win-win-win strategies where you're taking care of your people, your planet, and your health all together? Or are we going to have another situation like what we have in Paraguay, for example, or the Chaco in Argentina, which is that forest is disappearing faster than any other one in the entire planet. And so, and along with this is, you know, you're impacting, you know, just the climate in various different places in unforeseen ways. You're impacting the access to water. You're impacting, I mean, it's just this ripple effect where it seems like it's one small biome, but it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and impacts the entire planet and what we're talking about. So yeah, so many cautionary tales in Latin America, and perhaps Colombia then is a place that, oh, they got it right, or seems to be, or at least taking the early steps. I wanted to ask about the role of and it's been mentioned some, the role of the private sector. And I mean, there's all sorts of new fascinating tracing mechanisms and systems that are coming up that you can see kind of the products and the crops and the food sources moving, you know, back and forth on the food chain where they eventually end up to the consumers, the blockchain, which I'm trying to understand more of, then brings also a kind of more transparency to this, or where you can kind of see things as they move along. What's the role of the private sector in this? I mean, is there a sincerity to them? Are they driven by what would be driving them? Are they driven by kind of market influences? The sustainability of their supply chains moving forward? What is the key to kind of having the private sector help drive all this as well? Fabrice?
Yeah, but I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that. One of our flagship programs is FRESH, Food Reform for Environmental Sustainability and Health, which is a partnership between EAT and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And we have 40 companies that are part of that program, including Cargill, Kellogg's, Unilever, Nestle, Syngenta, who I think is here also sponsoring today's organization, who are looking to the Lancet guidelines, our dietary guidelines, and our environmental sustainability guidelines, and who are asking themselves how they can contribute to bringing food systems into this safe operating space, the food that is produced sustainably and healthy. I think it's critical to recognize that for those companies, we're in an environment where there's zero to little trust, I think, in terms of the companies themselves, although complete reliance on them for food safety, on the other hand. I mean, there's a report this morning about U.S. opposes dietary guidelines as we renegotiate NAFTA. So Chile has rolled out some progressive labeling that a very clear label on food items says excess sodium, excess sugar, excess calories, and that's being fought by many of the companies that we're talking about or working with. So I think there's a pattern of repeatedly confronting or showing actions against progress rather than proactive actions for. But on the flip side, again, I think many of these companies are quite sincere in trying to be a part of that solution. Paul Pullman from Unilever, I think, has been a tremendous champion in really bringing other CEOs along in trying to really make business more purposeful in their mission. So I think he's really been emphasizing that finance and profits are important, but there's a social purpose, an environmental purpose, and health purpose that needs to also be written into the bottom lines of these companies. Two examples. Last week we met in London with 5 of those companies on a science and strategy dialogue on putting food in food, which specifically addressed this topic of, can processed and packaged foods be healthy, and can they contribute to environmental conservation? And the resounding answer is yes. We can reformulate foods that they improve the nutritional quality, and also every ton of food that we save from landfills, save from waste, is hectares of land that we don't need to convert into agricultural production. So there is a strong conservation element to processing and packaging in terms of reducing food waste and loss. We reconvened with another group of companies, NTNC here in Washington, April 23rd, 24th, 25th, on What's the Beef with Beef, to address this topic of beef production. And again, here, I think focusing on reducing consumption, sustainable production practices, and whether there can be reformulation of meat products that are healthy and sustainable. So just, I don't think we recommend everyone go to vegetarian diets, and I think there's a critical role for livestock in pasturelands, both in terms of providing ecosystem services, but I think it's also quite fundamental to recognize that in the US, overconsumption of meat is 7 orders of magnitude, right? So we're consuming 70 grams per day. The recommendation is more 14 grams per day. And this has a huge environmental cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and also a huge health cost. I mean, the US savings in terms of healthcare moving towards a low-risk diet is $130 billion per year. So it's, I think just need to recognize that the cost of unhealthy diets is both faced and felt on the environmental side, but also is very much felt by the health sector. 70% overweight in the US, 40% obese in the US. Not overweight, 40% obese. I mean, that is huge, folks. And this is a result of the kinds of foods that we eat in combination with low activity levels.
Yeah, that's great. You've got us moving from where's the beef to what's the beef with beef. So part of the progress of the progression.
We think it's just important for the private sector partners to understand what are the questions. Why is there this focus on beef? And if we can have a common understanding as to why this is a problem, that allows us to talk about solutions, including the barriers to those solutions.
Yeah. Well, also this whole issue of mistrust, because this area has been so fraught, this realm, throughout the years. and that the finance, the income, the economics of it, you would think would be also so vitally linked in with the preservation and sustainability of their supply chains in the future, and having a stake of, well, what kind of world are we left with or leading to as we supply and nourish the world. So Junior and Howdy.
Yeah, so I wanted to just pick up on one thing that Fabrice was saying there about the health sector, because what you find is that, you're always looking at, there's kind of, you're looking at the core components. There's market pull, there's producer level, there's market pull, and there's public policy, right? And a lot of these issues, when you're trying to have that conversation about public policy, you're kind of like speaking to deaf ears. And then when you start to talk about the implications of health and how much it's costing that country to not address these issues, then you actually get a whole nother conversation going. So you could be talking to the Minister of Finance, because he's the one that makes a lot of these core decisions. Like, you'll have the Minister of Agriculture who's fully on board. You'll have, but when you actually are able to paint that picture of how these things are interconnected, that's when you really start to have some of these conversations. And on that point, I did just want to mention a little bit about market incentives, if I could. There's two things that I would like to bring up here, which I think points to how challenging this problem is for us. So if you look at the Cerrado in Brazil, it's this pristine grasslands that are larger than the Midwest. I mean, they're huge and they're critically important to the hydroecology of the entire country of Brazil. And they're being converted right now at a pace that is, just mind-boggling. And part of the reason that, part of the concern there is, if you look at this, you've got already converted land that could absorb all of this increased demand for soy without having to convert new native habitat. And it's already there, and it's highly suitable land. So you say, well, why do people keep converting new land? They have to go through all the trouble, the paperwork, this and that, when they could just be using that land. And the truth of the matter is that to buy already converted land, so land where the natural habitat has been altered, is 7 times more than to buy land with native habitat. So what's being valued is the conversion and not the native habitat. That market signal is huge, right? And so that leads me to just this, my other point, which is something that TNC is now looking at closely with even Stanford and the WEF and a few others. This is kind of a nascent work that we're looking at. But if you look at how land is valued now, and I think, Catherine, you mentioned this earlier, what is valued, or someone did, is what we take from the land, right? So it's what comes from the land. The market is not actually valuing the future productivity of the land itself. Now, if you look at that ecosystem, I think it was something you mentioned, Fabrice, if you look at, if we actually changed the market at the Wall Street level, and you created a futures market for the future productivity of that land, how would that change how we produce today?
Great question. I was with the Wall Street Journal for 30 years. I should have some kind of insight into that, but stumped. So Howdy and Catherine on this, and then we'll go to audience questions, and Fabrice, if you want to add something as well. But
yeah, I just want to make the point that I think there's always a role for the public sector, but the private sector to work together. Just give an example of our orange mazes in Africa. So currently, maize is the main staple. Most of the maize is white in Africa. It's all driven by the private sector. Smallholder farmers produce the maize. It's collected by wholesalers. It's milled. It's sold by retailers. New varieties of hybrid seed are white hybrids by private seed companies. My vision is that 20, 25 years from now, that whole production system is still in place, but it's all orange maize instead of white maize. The private companies were not going to develop, they weren't going to jumpstart that. They weren't going to go into business of developing orange maize and trying to change demand. That's the public sector's role. So under Harvest Plus now, we've developed the varieties, we've developed the technology, and we're doing the things that it takes to create a demand for orange varieties. And so now private seed companies are starting to develop their own orange varieties. They're starting to introduce them in countries where Harvest Plus is not working. So it's a cooperation between the public and private sector that's going to generate this result.
Catherine, did you have some thoughts, or Fabrice?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the private sector, well, the entire food system is pretty much owned by the private sectors. You cannot engage in that system without engaging with the private sector. And certainly a lot of the innovation that is up and coming now, even in markets where people really thought, oh, there's a market failure, no one's going to be interested, the public sector needs to step in. Some of these new innovative financing mechanisms, small companies that are coming up with really dynamite ideas that can be tapped into, I think are absolutely, it's an imperative for us to work with them. But I also feel like we should not, as researchers and as public policy people in our roles in those hats, we should allow ourselves the ability to say, look, we're going to work together where things work together, but it's going to be okay to say, hey, we're going to disagree on some things when a policy issue that has an effect on a major health concern or a major environmental concern or a major agriculture concern that goes against a profit motive, but that's for a public good, if you will, from an economic standpoint. I don't think that we should be afraid to continue to speak up and say that. I think there is a role for public policy to not be always influenced by the way that the private sector thinks about the world. It comes from two different perspectives, and I think we have to be clear about that.
Exactly. Did you have another thought?
Yeah, I just want to come back to evaluation Cerrado really quickly. So I think the topic of the session you mentioned was how do we nourish and save? And I think that in that title, there's actually something really big that's kind of hidden, and that's we're saying that we're used to saying that people starving or not having food is a non-transgressible boundary. You have to produce enough to feed those people. And I think the narrative is changing, and it's recognizing, yeah, you have to do that, but you also have to keep climate at 2 degrees, and you have to keep phosphorus and nitrogen out of water, and you have to conserve half a land for biodiversity, and these are all equally non-transgressible. And people have a really hard time with that, but that's fundamentally where we are with Anthropocene science, right? We can keep putting carbon in the atmosphere, but we will pay for it. I mean, it's $36 billion in federal aid for the US alone this year. So we now have multiple non-transgressibles, which means the solutions have to also be and. But going back to Cerrado and this valuation question, what that means for a country like Brazil is that there's a global community that's kind of tickling and saying, your Cerrado is worth more to us in terms of climate regulation and biodiversity conservation than it is for food production. And that opens up a whole set of really hairy questions that we need to be asking ourselves. Say, okay, Brazil might accept that, but then say, well, who's going to pay? It's the same thing for Indonesia. It's the same thing for Central Africa, and same thing for other parts of the world for different boundaries. And so I think this question of values is one that really is going to require quite a bit of attention that is going to become, I think, manifest in our trade dialogues, and which I think is going to be mission critical if we're going to reach these targets. So we talk about dietary shifts, reducing food waste and loss, increasing simultaneous as all means by which you can reach healthy diets from some production systems for 10 billion in 2050. But trade is I think, the other elephant in the room, that if we don't have trade policies that allow us to source from low-risk areas into high-risk areas, then we're not going to meet the target. So that's, I think, a critical question that we're going to need some help in addressing.
Yeah, great framing. Questions? Wow, okay. You're popular. Let's go Mark at the back, and then yeah, I need to write all this down. Keep your hands up.
Hi, Mark Kaplan. I recently was with Unilever running digital for the Chief Sustainability Office. Now I'm working for a blockchain integrated seafood trading company. I'm actually working on exactly using blockchain to enable trade finance in the areas that you're talking about. One of the questions that I had, we're focusing on seafood first. How come the ocean is never talked about in these conversations? It is like, right? So that's my question.
Right. Well, it will now. if you guys can help me taking notes, right? Remember these questions. We'll take a couple of questions. Go here and then. While the mic's here, we'll do these two, and then we'll move over here.
Hi, my name is Carrie Lajeunesse, and I'm with a private consulting business, but also a veterinarian and a representative for the One Health Commission. So I'm very, very grateful, especially for Ginia and Catherine's mention of this human, animal, and environmental interface. As veterinarians, we kind of cut our teeth on that. You know, the genesis was out of an agrarian society. I tend to work at that interface of poverty alleviation and global health and biodiversity conservation. How can we start leveraging resources across the global health and environmental and food production spaces? One of my big concerns is what we're seeing with outbreaks of emerging infectious and zoonotic diseases, and a lot of that goes hand in hand with impinging on these wild spaces. And so happy to see somebody in the Seattle area working on these issues. So that's my question. Then also as a public good, getting more people who are trained in animal health and more funding for animal health programs, I think particularly because we know that as much as biofortification is helpful, we can't get cognitive and physical development of kids if they don't get some animal source foods.
Right. Yep. Thanks for raising that. Oh, Carrie, right here. So if we keep the questions, short, we're doing a great job on that. Then we'll take two more, and then we'll get responses.
Good morning. Interesting panel. Margaret Catley Carlson. I've sat on a number of CG boards, ran the Canadian Development Assistance Program, and I'm here with Syngenta Foundation. So. And I'm very interested in the number of things that you're talking about. My question is basically for Ginny. Ginny, you have trampled all over one of the slides that I have been using for a very long time. So you better correct me, or we better find out what's wrong. When we look at the amount of increased food demand created by the prosperity of the last 10 years and the fact that all over the globe people can buy more food, there was different colors in those vertical charts, and the biggest one was fodder. Fodder takes up, feed and fodder for animals takes up 2/3 to 3/4, depending on whose charts you're using. Now, you said that if we cut out or cut down a lot of animal production, we would have to then plant a great part of the world, a much greater part of the world, in the other, presumably fruits, berries, etc., vegetables, etc. How come? I mean, why wouldn't the land that has gone to fodder simply move over into the required non-fodder plant materials that would then fill up the other? You got the anyway. You got to tell me whether I should go home and destroy the slide or whether I just need to. And can I ask a second question? It'll be short.
Sure, and then we'll go there.
When all of you, when you were talking about the changes that need to take place in farming systems, I can very easily visualize this when you're talking about technical assistance being added to small farms around the world. When you think about a Nebraska corn farm, what's your message there? I mean, obviously they've got the message about fertilizer runoff and about all sorts of things because they're very alert and alive to these issues. But when you're talking about these really diversified farms, how possible is that in a big Nebraska corn farm that has the cliched multiple harvesters going across the field, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go here, then we'll have 7 minutes, 8 minutes or so for responses. No, here. Then.
Thank you.
Quick,
Bruce
right.
Rubin, Nenco Advisors. My question is, how does the lack of a cold chain affect the work you're doing from the most rural part of the world to the market? And we have what we think is a solution, but I'd like the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your solution. I'm going to go to India in a couple of weeks and look into that, particularly in reducing waste. I think the cold chain is absolutely vital. So, you guys, open answers. Any other questions particularly applying to you? I know there's one for Ginia in particular, but.
Well, I'm happy to talk about seafood and the cold chain, because I know a lot about the cold chain. The seafood, I think it's just an oversight. I think we absolutely are thinking about that. And in fact, when you look at low environmental footprint animal source food production, fish come way up on that very quickly, as do things like edible insects, small rodents, which nobody in the US talks about, but these are parts of people's diets all over the world that we should be thinking about. I'll tell you another big one, synthetics. They are absolutely on the radar screen. If you haven't read the book Clean Meat, you should get it out of the library and take a read through. It's very, very interesting. And that's why I think like a lot of these technological solutions, whether it's in terms of production of, from traditional livestock, or whether you're talking about things that haven't been traditionally thought about from a Western diet, but are very much a part of other people's diets, or new technologies that are really going to have breakthrough, I think, in terms of being able to provide high quality animal source proteins, essential proteins, which we know are really important for linear growth. That's what gives kids that linear growth. That there are going to be new ways to produce those that are going to have a much lower environmental footprint, and probably really help to meet the demand that is going to increase by 60 to 70% by 2050. So fish, absolutely, I think is a part of that mix. I think it was an oversight on our part for not mentioning it specifically.
And thanks for mentioning insects. That was one of the questions coming in on my pad. How do we persuade the world to eat bugs? And so something we should also think about as critical moving forward. Another source of protein. So I think that is really an innovative thing also to look into. Ginya, you were specifically addressing, and Fabrice and Howdy.
So maybe I'll touch very briefly on a couple other questions.
Yeah, because you guys can also sort this out afterwards
from Margaret,
as well. Margaret's charts.
Sure. So just on the topic of global health, environment, and food productivity and diseases and those interlinkages. I mean, one of the things that we know is that biodiversity is absolutely critical for balancing this. The same is true of agro-biodiversity. So when you get into things like soy monocropping, for example, which is rampant in many places, you are asking for trouble. I mean, even then when you go from, what's happening is when you don't do like crop rotation systems and you just do subsequent crops, so from soy to corn is another thing that's being done, but you're not doing an actual rotation system. Some of those pests that attack the soy are now attacking the corn. That never happened before. So I think we have to look at this. Again, the focus has to shift from just yield to what is this ecological balance. So just briefly on that one. And then briefly on the cold chain, going back to Colombia, in many places in Colombia you can have these great silvopastoral systems, but because there is not a cold chain for beef, by the time that beef gets to market, it's tough. So nobody wants to pay the price. So that's a really critical element. And then to the Syngenta question, so I actually have three responses for you. One is that it takes a lot more land to produce fruits and vegetables than it does to produce pulses. A lot more land, a lot more water. They're not necessarily the same biomes. And so it's not quite, we can remove this and do this. And is the question, or what Howdy commented earlier, you're also not getting the same nutrients. So if you're reducing some of those animal proteins and those amino acids, et cetera, you've really got to balance it out with just a huge additional, not saying that's bad, but you really have to be cognizant of all of those other nutrients that you have to get. Again, I already mentioned it's different biomes, so the same food that you can grow, where you would grow soy, you're not going to grow citrus, right? You're just not. It's just you can't. It's not adaptable like that. And then finally, the other thing with things like soy, which is for cattle and chickens and all kinds of other, pork. It's a huge source of cattle or feed for all of those things I just mentioned. It's also a source of food and it's a source of fuel. So in China, for example, soy milk is the rage. Dairy milk, why would you drink that? And so it gets repurposed for these different things depending on demand. So it's a little bit more of nuance. So I'm not sure if I've helped you or hindered your progress forward.
Howdy, then Fabrice.
Just before I got involved in biofortification, I looked at patterns of how economic factors like incomes, food prices affected diets and health outcomes. And in developing countries, animal product consumption is very low, but all the correlations between health outcomes, any extra meat consumption was always very positively correlated with better health outcomes. So I feel that increased meat consumption from such a low base is probably very good for health and nutrition. It's just when you get to the West and you get to these very high incomes, people way over consume it. So it's, that is some balance that you need to take into account, I think.
Yeah. Fabrice, did you?
Yeah, on seafood, I feel like Gunhild planted that question for you because that's what she's always asking me as well. Why aren't we doing marine and aquatic systems? I think it's a place where food will be a silo buster, to be honest with you. I think the environmental community, in terms of marine biologists and terrestrial biologists, we're not used to working with each other. They're just such different systems, land-based, spatially based versus a three-dimensional system. There's some work on terrestrial to marine flows of nutrients, but really very, very little. I think even some defensive space. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services pushed to have oceans in that assessment, and we're told, no, there's a global oceans assessment, don't touch it. And so I think there's still some resistance, and I think people are, like you, increasingly raising the flag and saying, basta ya, time to stop that, and we need more integrated models. For our models show that transitions to vegetarian, pescatarian diets do significantly reduce land allocations. And of course, pulses do require quite a bit of land to fill that protein gap, but still less than a meat diet, at least from what we've seen. But it's not, I agree, it's not a simple conversion of hectare per hectare, and space does become important. For the Nebraska farmer, I think what we've tried to do with our work at EAT is to say, we're willing to test conventional, organic, GMO, whatever system against the Earth system boundaries. And so for the Nebraska farmer, our question would be, what quality food are you producing? How much carbon are you putting into soil or into the atmosphere? How much nitrogen phosphorus are you allowed to transition from terrestrial into aquatic systems? Are you reserving 10% space for biodiversity on that land? So it's not really a question of polyculture, monoculture, but really wanting to be able to assess multiple diversified production systems at a global scale against these Earth systems. And I think for that, it's really an all hands on deck type of approach. Are we producing the right kinds of foods in the right ways? There will be a need for monocultural systems, I think, particularly for grains, as there will be a need for diversified systems, particularly for fruits, vegetables, and fruits and vegetables.
Good. Well, thank you to everybody. The clock here has just ticked past 11:30, which was our closing time. But if we look outside and it's still snowing and you want to stay in here, please do. We may be hanging around for a while.
Just make one comment on the funding, because I think it's a really important point. Within the next couple of months, the Bridge Collaborative, in conjunction with Panorama, is going to be looking at multisectoral funding and where it's coming from and sort of what it looks like. So please go to the website, www.bridgecollaborativeglobal.org. And keep an eye out for that, because it's on everybody's radar screen. We need to rethink our funding models as well. And I think it's a great question and something that is increasingly important as we're looking at trying to move multisectoral programs around. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question and for that answer, Catherine, for raising this. And I was going to say, on the funding front, if there's a few dollars left over for the storytelling of all of this, this may be the subject of my next book. So I'd be interested in that as well. So, but Ginya had something. See, we were thinking that we could go all day with a panel like this. And Brian, we need to do this at the Chicago Council. There's Brian, our director of studies.
We could take a week on this.
So a panel, an evening in Chicago on this, or back in Washington or somewhere. This is just so fascinating and so critical to our future, so we can go on. But Ginya,
just maybe one, just to end on a little bit of good news. So I'm going to give a shout out here to Whole Foods, because they're actually putting in place a whole new, I'm not quite sure if they've already done it or if it's in process, but when you look at the produce and how they rank their produce, like currently you've got your conventional on one side and your organic on the other side, which always bothers me because I don't know which one to buy because I don't know how it was produced, right? And they are actually putting in place a whole new system which is rating these foods based on the environment, nutrition, all of these components of Bridge Collaborative. And so if you could have a piece of conventional produce that is, you know, off the charts, and a piece of organic one which actually doesn't do very well, based on this new rating system of how we're really integrating all of those core components. So that's really exciting.
And it's potentially being scaled through Amazon now, which is even more exciting.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, thank you. As I said, we can go on, and wouldn't be a bad way to spend a day. I think the next session here is it at 2? The storytelling session. You want to hear more from me? I'll be there. Be regaling with some stories there as well. So please join, tell some stories. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the panel. As I said, really pioneers in this new frontier that we need to be successful on, and extremely eloquent on the thinking. So you'll be hearing much more from them as the years go by with innovations and forward thinking on this. So thank you very much. And yeah, any other questions, particularly students, feel free to come up and besiege us with your thoughts. Thank you.